What if I told you that there was an NBA superstar who refused to score normally, a player who finished around the basket in such unusual ways that he inspired many of your favorite guards today and changed how point guards score forever? That player was Tony Parker, a 6'2" French guard who somehow kept finishing near the top of the NBA in points scored in the paint, a category usually dominated by giants. So how did he actually do it? Well, floaters, spin moves, and wrong foot layups. Finishes almost nobody else was using at the time. And while defenders struggled to stop him, Parker was helping the Spurs to win 4 NBA championships and becoming the first ever European player to win the Finals MVP. So what exactly made Tony Parker's scoring style so unusual? And how did a small guard from France end up changing basketball forever? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to the 1990s. William Anthony Parker Jr., or better known simply as Tony, despite being born in Belgium and raised in France, spent his summer back in his father's home state of Chicago.
My dad is from Chicago, born and raised. My whole family's from Chicago, so they were huge Bulls fans. So growing up, I would always wake up at 3 in the morning, watch all the games.
Where Tony Sr. played collegiate basketball at Loyola before playing professionally overseas, where he met his son's mother, Pamela. But it was because of these constant travels that a young Parker would make a huge change in 1990.
When I was a kid, I would always follow my dad, and he was a basketball player, and I would try to do everything he did, try to imitate him. And if he was shooting, I was shooting. If he was stretching, I was stretching. And, he was like my hero, basically. It started with him, that's for sure. I think it helps, when you have it at home. Even if he never pressure us to play basketball, he always say, you can do whatever you want. Because on that picture, you see me play basketball. I was maybe 2 or 3, I think, on that picture. But at 6 years old, I started to play soccer.
Yeah. So I played soccer. France, in France, soccer is the #1 sport.
Right.
So I played soccer 6 to 9 years old. And then when I saw the NBA Finals with Magic and Jordan, I decided to switch sports.
I want to thank Michael Jordan. He was my idol growing up. He's the reason why I wanted to play basketball. He was my inspiration. I had posters of him in my whole room.
However, due to Tony's tiny stature, many back home in France thought it was impossible for Parker to truly follow in his father's footsteps.
When I was in France, they will always say, oh, you're too small, you're too skinny, you will never make it.
Yet TP just used this as motivation whilst also developing a unique skill set in order to overcome his size.
Teardrop was a great shot for me because I had to find a way to score and to shoot over the bigs, and so I've been doing that shot since I was a kid.
But it was after being accepted into INSEP, the French National Sports Institute, that Tony would truly be vocal about his dreams.
And I wanted to go in the NBA, and I wanted to become the first European point guard to make it in the NBA.
A goal that, after debuting against grown men at Paris Basket Racing in 1999, and then competing at the Nike Hoop Summit, representing Europe in an exhibition game against America.
Oh, nice spin move. Great spin. Beautiful.
In which Tony dropped 20 points and 7 assists that he was close to achieving. You see, American college scouts were desperately trying to claw the Frenchmen away from pro basketball and onto their campuses.
It was between the UCLA and Georgia Tech.
But with Parker Sr. guiding his son to remain developing against players who were closer to who Tony would be battling in the NBA, Parker Jr. opted to return to France for a final international season before placing his name in the 2001 draft. Yet, would NBA teams actually be interested in an international prospect who had never played a full season on American soil? Speaking of making moves, are you sick of constantly juggling between different tabs and software in order to keep track of your business? Well, today's video sponsor, Odoo, the all-in-one business management tool, can help you simplify your day-to-day workload by keeping all of your operations under one single roof. For example, let's say I decide to open a cafe. I could use Odoo for literally everything, from the point of sale app to sell coffees on site, to e-commerce if I wanted to sell beans online, as well as handle the back-end accounting. The best part about all this, it's all integrated. meaning that as soon as I make a sale, an invoice will automatically be generated in the accounting app. To make things even easier for you, Odoo's automation tools can save you hours of boring manual data entry so you can focus more on working on the business rather than in it, or just enjoying the coffee. So to get started with Odoo's all-in-one business platform today, click the link in the description to try Odoo right now with a 15-day free trial with no credit card, and you get any single app of your choice for free. Thank you Odoo for sponsoring today's video, which let's get back to. Because Parker, despite completing 15 pre-draft workouts for 15 different NBA teams, ran into some serious doubt, even from squads who had already chosen and were open to drafting international players.
You know, I did a workout in Chicago. I just flew 15 hours, landed, went straight to practice, and that was the first time I saw him, first time they see me. And I sucked at that workout. You know, I was not that good. I was still jet lagged, and Pop basically was like, he's never going to play in the NBA.
But the San Antonio Spurs general manager, R.C. Buford, and his assistant, Sam Presti, held an opposing opinion of their head coach, Greg Popovich, believing that Parker might just be their point guard of the future. So the group invited Tony back.
I'm not going to let it go, you know, like I want to make it. So I don't care what he's going to do. You know, I'm going to come back the next day and show that he's wrong, you know.
And it was during the second session in which everything would truly change for Tony Parker.
The Spurs, when I did my second workout, they were like, Pop told me like, man, you're going to be top 15. There's no way we're going to get you. You're going to be top 15.
However, unfortunately for the Texas franchise, Greg Popovich's sudden shift in outlook turned out to be true, because the Boston Celtics, with their 21st pick, had locked in on Tony Parker.
You have Chrissy who works for the NBA. She tells me, okay, you have to be ready. Boston's going to draft you. Gives me the cap, Celtics cap.
Except they hadn't.
I thought I was going to go to Boston. I had the cap and everything.
That's crazy.
And so what happened, what I learned after, is the head coach and the GM, so Jim O'Brien at the time and Chris Wallace was the GM at the time, they wanted me, but Auerbach was like, no, I want Joe Forte from North Carolina.
With the 28th pick in the 2001 draft, the San Antonio Spurs select Tony Parker of Racing Club Paris, France.
Then I go in the back, you know, I talked to Coach Pop, and I was like, Pop, I'm going to show everybody, all those teams, they made a mistake to draft me at the end of the first round. I was crazy at 19.
So, would Tony be right and prove Popovich wrong? Or did the Spurs just make a horrible mistake?
Right into the offensive rebounding zone.
Oh, here comes the newcomer. 19 years old from France, Tony Parker.
Not only
throwing it away out of the low post. That time he got it to fall.
However, the rookie Frenchman scoring 9 points in his NBA debut wasn't actually the most shocking thing that happened during his first week on the highest stage of basketball. Because just 4 games later on their flight to Orlando, Coach Pop told Parker something shocking.
You put me in the back in the plane, you call me and you're like, you starting tomorrow. I was like, really? I was like, did you talk to Timmy? Yeah, because I was still thinking he didn't like French people, so I was like a little bit scared, you know?
It's like, oh wow, I gotta go play with a 12-year-old against these pros.
I remember Pop when I first arrived. He's
Never
like,
let ball go.
I want you to be like Avery Johnson. And me in my head, no disrespect to Avery, bro. It's like, I don't want to be Avery Johnson.
But despite their superstar Tim Duncan's hesitancy, Parker only continued to dominate.
Here comes Parker, 3-on-1. To Smith.
Danny Ferry was a little bit tougher, and Derek Anderson. This is going to take some time.
Sacre bleu!
With Tony scoring 12 points and throwing 4 assists.
How would you rate your performance tonight? I don't like to say that. I'm happy that we win the game, and I try to do my best and try to run the team best I can.
Which the point guard followed up by dropping 22 against his sorta hometown Chicago Bulls, and then 19 on the Atlanta Hawks. It was clear Greg Popovich had found his point guard of the future just weeks into the 2001-2002 season.
His maturity level was off the charts. He understood everything that we said to him. he was able to handle criticism because I was very tough on it. And he just took it all in and got better and better, got tougher and tougher. At that young age, he was pretty remarkable.
However, Parker's first real challenge arrived as San Antonio looked to return to the mountaintop, which they had reached just 3 years ago in their round 1 battle against the Seattle Supersonics, Gary the Glove Payton. But even though Tony was still a teenager and was facing off against perhaps the greatest defensive point guard of all time, Parker's 21 points in his debut playoff battle saw him finally earning the respect of Tim Duncan.
It's not until I played good in my rookie year against Gary Payton finally say one word. Actually 2 words, 3 words. I'll remember. Basically, we'll be all right.
An insane performance, which was backed up by the French native thanks to 23 points in Game 3, and with San Antonio advancing into the second round, they were set for yet another almost impossible challenge. The back-to-back defending NBA champion Los Angeles Lakers, a series that most assumed LA would simply end by sweeping the Spurs out of the 2002 postseason. Or would they? Game 3.
For the Lakers to do to make an adjustment on Tim Duncan as we see Tony Parker spinning his way and is able to hit. Antonio over the first 2, he's about 46. Parker going the cut. 8 points here in the first quarter for Tony Parker. Parker again able to penetrate.
With the rookie guard providing a 12-point and 5-assist first half, which he followed up by doubling his point total as the final buzzer rang out, it seemed that Tony had just helped his franchise take a crucial 2-1 lead. However, their opponent was simply unstoppable.
So the Lakers defeating the Spurs 99-89, and they now lead this best of 7. 2-1.
Even with their 2002 MVP Tim Duncan averaging 29 points and 17.2 rebounds, and the rookie Parker providing nearly 14 points a night, without a reliable third scoring punch, the Spurs simply ran out of steam, losing this second round battle 4-1. But the San Antonio Spurs had a secret trick up their sleeve.
With the 57th selection in the 1999 NBA draft, the San Antonio Spurs select.
As the ball was tipped to open the 2002-2003 season, Tony Parker had set a clear goal.
I want to be named one of the best point guard in the league, and so
one that his head coach was hell-bent on ensuring that he fulfilled.
Still got a lot of young type mistakes out there out of inexperience, so we're hoping that we can continue to cut them bit by bit.
Me and Tim, we're the 2 guys, he had the most on us, because he expected a lot from us, and me, it's a little bit like father and son.
But it was actually the insane bet which the franchise made all the way back in 1999.
Antonio Spurs select Emmanuel Ginobili.
That changed everything for the Texas squad, as with Manu Ginobili entering the league as a 25-year-old rookie who had nearly a decade of professional experience in his home country of Argentina and then Italy, the team had found their clear third option. Because whenever their French guard scored 20 or more points, which he did 21 times, San Antonio was 20-1. And with the Spurs winning 32 of their final 38 games, the single title winning franchise grabbed the #1 seed in the Western Conference and was set for a first round battle against the 8th seeded Phoenix Suns. However, despite everyone outside of Arizona believing that this series belonged to San Antonio, with this happening in Game 1,
Marbury has it. Here's Marbury on the drive. Haynes and 3.
Oh! Man, can you believe it?
those opinions slowly began to flip. Combine this with all the doubt surrounding Tony Parker and his chances in the matchup against the man who had saved his squad in their first battle, Stephon Marbury.
Basically, every series in the newspaper they were saying they're not going to win the point guard matchup.
Everyone on San Antonio's squad was desperate to silence the negativity. Game 3.
Parker, who coming into this game was 3 for 20 from the field and 0 of 8 from 3.
I missed a lot of shots first two games. and I just tried to find a rhythm, you know, and today my first shot went in, and after that I was rolling.
Rebound to Robinson, and Parker now will dance up into the lane. Look at the crossover, blowing by Williams to the glass, and shoveled it up and in. What a move by Parker. We're 20 and 1 of those games. Parker for 3. Money. Tony Parker, 6 of 7, 13 points in the first quarter. Pass ahead of Parker. 3-on-2. Tony floats a butterfly up and in. A teardrop runner by Parker.
An insane 29-point outing, which showed, even at just 20 years old, that Tony Parker was truly becoming one of the top point guards in the whole NBA. But it only got better, as 3 games later, it was the Spurs once again advancing into the second round for a rematch against the Los Angeles Lakers.
The Lakers was a huge rivalry, because the Lakers was the standard.
A series that, as this happened to end Game 4,
the Lakers have evened it at 2 games apiece,
that LA was seemingly going to emerge victorious from. Only as the ball was tipped for their 5th battle, Tony Parker had different plans.
Parker with the shot, yes!
Yet, even with Tony providing 21 points on 50% shooting, it was the Lakers who had the chance to either tie or steal Game 5 on the road with 14.7 seconds remaining.
Here's Ori for 3! Robinson with the rebound that was in and out!
However, this wasn't the only crazy thing which had occurred during this series, as not only had Robert Horry, who at this point in his career had knocked down countless game winners, somehow missed, but with Parker pouring in 27 points throughout Game 6, it was finally San Antonio advancing to the Western Conference Finals.
I've played against Tony for years and years and years and years. He's responsible for me not winning more championships.
But guess what? The good news only continued to flow, because thanks to the second-year guard averaging 22.8 points, 4.3 assists, and 4 rebounds over their first 4 battles in the conference finals against state rival the Dallas Mavericks, it was San Antonio who had placed themselves just a single W away from the NBA Finals. Yet, the Mavs, led by their own international superstar Dirk Nowitzki, weren't just gonna accept defeat, stealing a crucial W on the Spurs home court throughout Game 5, and with Tony battling intense food poisoning, which saw him appear for just 10 minutes in Game 6, it seemed like a 7th and final battle was truly on the table. Except, as usual, Coach Pop had a trick up his sleeve.
Steve Curry's our hero tonight.
As with the 37-year-old veteran knocking down 4 huge threes, it was incredibly the San Antonio Spurs advancing to the NBA Finals for a battle against the New Jersey Nets.
And this is to the Nets.
However, in almost the same fashion as their Lakers series, with the Nets tying it at 1 apiece after Game 2, San Antonio was faced with a serious mountain to overcome. Because at that time, the finals were played in a 2-3-2 format, meaning the Spurs were set to face their rival in back-to-back away games. To make matters worse, with their opponent's point guard Jason Kidd entering free agency shortly after the series, the San Antonio Spurs were very interested in potentially replacing their youthful point guard with Kidd, unless TP could outperform him. So, Tony Parker, desperate to not only outplay Jason, but become the second youngest player to ever hoist the Larry O'Brien Trophy in NBA history, was unstoppable throughout Game 3.
Parker, tough catch in the paint, and he's got that little jump hook that he used the other night. Spurs all kinds of trouble. Can Parker hit another? Yes, he can. Tony Parker back-to-back threes. So now a quieted crowd here as the Nets trail by 8. Parker will try to make it double figures. He got it.
Pouring in 26 points whilst throwing 6 assists, seeing his Spurs leading 2 games to 1 before San Antonio would shockingly defeat the Nets yet again on their home court in Game 5 before crowning their point guard as the second youngest, second only to Magic Johnson, to ever win an NBA title.
That was amazing, you know, it's nothing compared to winning a championship, you know. When I saw it in 99, I said, oh, I hope one day it happened to me. And 3 years, 4 years after, it's my turn, so I'm just blessed, you know. It's like like a dream for me.
But one clear question remained. Could the Spurs, who had been victorious in 1999, finally defend their crown this time? Or would this be the final moment the Texas franchise ever hoisted the Larry O'Brien trophy? May 5th, 2004, after thwarting his rival's attempt to replace him and dominating not only the regular season, but round 1 of their title defense journey against the Grizzlies, in which Parker had averaged 21 points on 57% from the field and 69% from 3, plus 8.5 assist averages, Tony was desperate to add to his 20-point Game 1 resume versus the Lakers here tonight.
Why do you have so much confidence playing against the Lakers?
It's not just the Lakers, it's been the last 2 months. It's just the result of me getting more mature, and understand what Pops wants, and just be aggressive every night and be in attack mode.
So the crossover by Parker, and another bucket. Parker with a teardrop. Parker being played now by Joe. Oh, look at the crossover and the teardrop. What a move by Tony Parker.
A shocking 30-piece from Parker, which, just like their previous season, saw the Spurs holding the commanding 2-0 lead. However, LA, after bolstering their roster with Gary Payton and Karl Malone, were desperate to return to the ultimate round for yet another championship, seeing Los Angeles yet again tie the series as the buzzer rang out in Game 4. But San Antonio was somehow presented with an eerily similar situation to 2003 here in Game 5, as with just 0.4 seconds remaining and up 1, a 3-2 series lead was in their fingertips.
Here they go. They get it to Fisher. He scores! Derek Fisher scores at the buzzer!
Only it slipped right through as LA eliminated the defending champions in Game 6, seeing many begin to question if the Spurs were really building the newest NBA dynasty, or if they had just been lucky with the lockout-shortened season in 1999 and Ori's tragic miss in 2003. So, desperate to showcase that his franchise really was building something special, Parker was only continuing to showcase his natural gifts.
Oh yeah, his speed was incredible.
And also his ability to get to the rim, get hit, and still finish plays.
Combined with his elite skill.
Sometimes I just looked at him and said, I can't replicate that. I think I improved my cheat drops because of him, but finishing on one step like he did was very hard to do.
You know what surprised me is when he would change direction, especially when he would spin. He'd dribble in one direction, he would spin, and how he could keep his balance was always a mystery to me.
Floater, him scoring in the paint was legendary.
That allowed him to dominate the NBA, a 16.6 point and 6.1 assist average, plus finishing near the top of the league in points in the paint, a stat generally reserved for giant centers, which saw the Spurs finishing second in the West and preparing for a first-round matchup against the surging Denver Nuggets. However, with their Colorado rival, much like Phoenix did in 2003, stealing a Game 1 victory.
First loss against Denver really hurt, and it was just, we realized that we need to fight, and Denver was for real. Like, man, it's going to be a long playoffs.
The doubt that this Texas franchise could once again reach the mountaintop began to rise, and on May 2nd, 2005, everything would take a massive turn for the San Antonio Spurs. As having battled doubt his whole career, whether it was from people in France who thought he was too small, to his own head coach, then his front office, Tony Parker, despite being just 22 years old, held a mindset akin to a grizzled 15-year veteran. A thought process which helped Tony to pour in 29 points plus 7 assists, most of those crucial down the stretch in Game 4 that saw San Antonio grabbing a 3-1 lead before eliminating Denver just a battle later. Yet, for what was now the 3rd season in a row, their second-round rival, this time the Ray Allen-led Seattle Supersonics, had the opportunity to force a 7th and final game here tonight in Game 6.
And you have to be careful not to foul, especially foul Ray Allen. Allen comes free, puts up a three. Oh, it just misses. And the Spurs advance to the conference final.
Thanks to Allen's mistake and driven to prove the blunders against Denver and Seattle were simply flukes, Tony opened their Western Conference Finals series against fellow international point guard Steve Nash and his Phoenix Suns with a 29-point night, something that Parker simply followed up with a 20.4 point average over their next 4 that finally saw his Texas squad returning to the NBA Finals for a chance to snag Tony his second Larry O'Brien trophy. However, facing off against the defending NBA champion Detroit Pistons, who had just dethroned one of the most stacked rosters in league history to that point, could they really get it done? June 16th, 2005.
Obviously, we're not playing well. Detroit seems that they play like they wanted more than us, and we just have to show that we wanted to. You know, we're not playing hard enough.
The Detroit Pistons, after embarrassingly going down 2-0, have just clawed their way back in dominant fashion throughout Game 3, and then again here tonight, destroying their rival by a shocking 31 points. To make matters worse, while Robert Horry, who the Spurs had acquired before the 2003-04 season, had saved his franchise in Game 5.
To Horry for 3. Oh, unbelievable. This guy is off the charts.
With the Pistons' emphatic response in Game 6 on San Antonio's home court meant the NBA Finals all came down to this.
Game 7!
Win or lose the championship? I mean, what else could be worse than that? Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker, 3 players all born outside of the continental United States, were hungry to prove that their franchise was truly a dynasty. Therefore, with Duncan adding 25, Ginobili 23, and Parker 8, they had done the seemingly impossible.
And for the 3rd time in 7 seasons, the San Antonio Spurs are the NBA champions.
So, with Tony earning his 2nd ring and the franchise's 3rd in just 6 years, could the San Antonio Spurs finally defend their crown? Or would this be the last time this squad stepped foot onto the highest stage of basketball? Well, Parker, understanding that he needed to continue to evolve his game, made a huge change before the 2005-2006 season.
Decided to work with a shooting coach. His name was Chip England.
Hey, Chip. That's like, you know, we worked with him coming out in the draft. That's our guy, Chip.
I know.
Be a machine.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's when I started working with Chip, you know, and that's how I got better then with my mid-range and improved my 3-point shot, and that's when I made my first All-Star team in 2006.
However, despite this decision seemingly being geared towards attempting more threes, it was truly done by Tony simply to force defenses to close him out further, thus opening the room up for Parker to attack and highlight all his unique and awkward finishes. Because despite improving from 27% to 31% from 3, Tony ended up incredibly leading the whole NBA in points in the paint as a 6'2" guard. But at the end of the day, no one cared about this in San Antonio. The only thing which mattered to their franchise was Larry O'Brien trophies. And with Tim Duncan adding in 41 points here in Game 7 of their 2nd round battle against state rival, and Manu knocking down the go-ahead 3, it seemed almost guaranteed that the Spurs would once again be returning to the Western Conference Finals. All they had to do was get one last stop.
We up 3. We says, don't foul. If they get a layup, fine, take it out.
Member of 2 champion San Antonio Spurs teams, a member of the Olympic gold medal team for his native Argentina. 21 points for Ginobili, 19 in the second half. Nowitzki goes right at Bowen, and the foul! So Nowitzki to the line with a chance to tie the game.
But why did you foul? We were up 3, you know, up 3 in Game 7.
Yet, despite this epic blunder, San Antonio still had plenty of time to score and push themselves into the penultimate round and past this tragic mistake.
Down to 5, down to 4, down to 3. Ginobili squeezes through. Duncan on the follow, the shot blocked, and we go to overtime.
However, having been blessed with an insane opportunity, the Dirk Nowitzki-led Dallas Mavericks were simply unstoppable throughout this game's extra period, meaning the defending NBA champions were yet again ripped from their throne far too early, depressing everyone on their roster.
We were all hurt. The faces were really sad, and it was hard to talk to each other because how upset we felt.
And you go back in the locker room, and I saw Michael Finley cry.
And you were crying, and I took that to heart. Like you were crying, and I was like, man, we didn't do it. And so 2007, my only motivation the whole year, it was to try to bring you a championship.
Therefore, Tony Parker, motivated to not only crown his teammate who had just left the Mavericks to join the Spurs for the sole reason of winning a championship, but prove his own value to the Texas franchise, was locked in all season long.
Tony, just from the go, just had a different, whatever it was, you just saw it in his eyes where he was going to get it done.
Averaging 18.6 points on 39% from 3, plus 5.5 assists as the Spurs ended yet again near the top of the West as its 3rd seed. However, once again, with their Game 1 loss to the Denver Nuggets in Round 1, that same doubt which had crept in 2003 and 2005 began to reappear. But San Antonio had been here before, because Parker, after averaging just under 20 points on 6.4 dimes a night, would go on to lead a gentleman's sweep against their Nugget rivals before dropping 32 on Steve Nash's head during Game 1 of their 2nd round series against the Phoenix Suns, a performance which he crowned by adding in 30 during their matchup winning Game 6 before decimating the Utah Jazz 4-1 in the conference finals, seeing Tony yet again returning to the NBA Finals, a series that the Frenchman was ready to truly take over.
I knew I was ready. In my head, I always dreamt about this, worked hard for this, and I just had to just be myself and play my game.
Because facing off against the very young LeBron James-led Cleveland Cavaliers, a franchise that only had a single member of their team who had ever come this far in the postseason, presented Tony with a unique opportunity.
That series, the matchup was good for me, and everybody was playing for me, sending picks for me, and everybody saw very early that I was rolling. Just one of those series, like everything is going well, and you just keep being aggressive.
As a 27-point night in Game 1 and then 30 in Game 2.
And his speed was unbelievable. He killed us.
Saw his franchise rocket out to an early 2-0 lead, all before Tony poured in 17 in Game 3.
I think he finally felt totally confident. He just put his foot in the neck of that team and would not let up. He was unstoppable.
And delivered the crushing blow with 24 in Game 4, resulting in Tony Parker doing something no other NBA player had done in the history of the league, becoming the first ever European player crowned as the Finals MVP. Then, for some reason, he decided in the offseason to win another crown, rocketing to the #1 spot on the French charts with his rap song Balance Toi. What a guy. But yet again, you already know the question passing through the lips of every NBA analyst. Could the now 4-time championship winning franchise finally defend one of their titles? February 1st, 2008.
When Mitch Kupchak came to you and said something like, I can get you Pau Gasol for Kwame Brown, what did you say back?
No, you can't. But
and Spanish treasure arise on the shores of Los Angeles. Last little nugget, simply the biggest NBA in-season trade so far this year, as the Lakers acquired talented big man Pau Gasol from the Grizzlies.
LA, ever since the departure of 3-time Finals MVP winning big man Shaquille O'Neal after their failure at the hands of the Detroit Pistons in the 2004 Finals, had been struggling for relevancy, being led by Kobe Bryant. However, this move to acquire versatile big Pau Gasol has just bolstered the Lakers' Spurs roster, providing the now seasoned Bryant with the piece which would propel them to future championship success. A fact that, as the San Antonio Spurs emerged from an epic round 1 battle against the Phoenix Suns, in which Parker had dropped 32 in Game 2, 41 in Game 3, and 31 in Game 5, and eventually swatted the pesky Hornets after a 7-game series in round 2, that seemingly came true. Because with the Lakers and Spurs yet again facing off, this time in the conference finals, LA's new dynamic duo would ultimately hold San Antonio's title defense, as not even a 19.4 point average from their French point guard could see the Texas franchise win more than a single battle, resulting in the Lakers crowning themselves as kings of the Western Conference. To make things even worse for San Antonio, with Manu Ginobili suffering a serious ankle injury over the offseason, the hobbled Spurs arrived into a round 1 matchup against the Dallas Mavericks, only despite Tony's epic 38-point Game 2, 43-point Game 4, and 12-assist Game 5 should tragically fail in just round 1. But this failure against Dallas was merely the start of what was quickly becoming the fall of a dynasty, because with Tony Parker now being bitten by the injury bug during their 2009-2010 campaign, it was the Phoenix Suns who emerged victorious in round 2 after sweeping their former rival with ease, and with the 8-seeded Memphis Grizzlies destroying the 1st-seeded San Antonio Spurs in their 2010-2011 first-round matchup, San Antonio's dynasty had fallen. Or had it?
With the 15th pick in the 2011 NBA Draft, the Indiana Pacers select Kawhi Leonard from San Diego State University.
San Antonio, still led by the same general manager who had discovered both Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili, had just made a shocking move, trading away fan favorite guard George Hill to acquire this defensive-minded forward from California, Kawhi Leonard. A decision that, while it took San Antonio's veteran squad, who had nearly spent a decade on court together, some time to adapt, as the end of their 2011-2012 campaign came near, the Spurs had been on a tear, because the final buzzer in Game 2 of their Western Conference Finals series announced something shocking. The San Antonio Spurs, thanks to a 34-point night here from Tony Parker, had just won 21 games in a row. They had swept both the Utah Jazz and Los Angeles Clippers, and now were just 2 wins away from another NBA Finals. Combine this with the fact that they were facing a young and inexperienced Oklahoma City Thunder side, seemingly made this one of the greatest playoff runs of all time. Only in an almost similar fashion to their own 2003 team, the Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, and James Harden-led Thunder side, despite their relative lack of experience, combined with an expert move from their head coach, Scott Brooks, to have the much taller and longer Thabo Sefolosha guarding Parker, saw OKC begin to claw their way back. As not only would Thabo reduce Tony's effectiveness, shrinking his field goal percentage from 61% to just 41, but Durant's near 30-point average, Westbrook's 7.8 assists, and Harden's 15.5 points off the bench saw the Thunder shockingly reverse sweeping the San Antonio Spurs and advancing to the NBA Finals. Parker was devastated, vowing to his superstar running mate Tim Duncan that he would get his franchise back not only to the finals, but hoisting the Larry O'Brien trophy above their heads one final time. However, with age rapidly catching up with the Spurs roster, could they really ever get back to that point? And would Kawhi truly become the player that they needed in order to succeed? November 1st, 2012. After hitting a clutch, game-saving bucket in their opening night victory against the New Orleans Hornets, Tony Parker was looking to do the same thing here tonight against the franchise which had sent them home just 2 wins away from the NBA Finals.
It's Parker! Good! A cold-blooded game-winning shot by Parker!
An insane bucket that Parker followed up with 20.3 points on 52% from the field and 36% from 3 averages, plus still throwing 7.6 dimes a night, which resulted in San Antonio yet again sitting near the top of the Western Conference as its 2nd seed. Yet regular season victories meant little to Tony Parker, because the Frenchman, driven to make good on his promise to Duncan, led his franchise on a shocking run, setting a brand new career high of 18 assists during Game 2 of the Western Conference Finals against the same team who had eliminated them just 2 seasons ago, and propelling his squad back into the ultimate round with 37 points. An insane 12-2 run, which saw the veteran franchise not only returning to the NBA Finals, but after an insane victory in Game 5 and a dominant performance here tonight in Game 6 that saw the Texas franchise literally 28 seconds away from Tony's 4th, the franchise's 5th NBA championship.
In my head, I promise you, I'm like, man, we're gonna win the championship. Like, I'm like,
Right.
Hey, step back 3. I don't hit a lot of step back 3 Q. So I was like, man, step back 3 switch. I was like, woo. Then steal, then score. I was like, man, we up 5. I'm like, we good, you know?
Yeah.
28 seconds. I remember Pop was talking, and I can see my family coming down. They're putting the ropes and everything. I see the trophy.
Man.
They're preparing everything, you know?
However, the defending champion Miami Heat weren't done just yet.
Still loose, picked up by Miller. Back out to James, another 3. It's good!
To make matters worse for the San Antonio Spurs, with Kawhi copying his teammate Manu Ginobili and only knocking down just 1 of his 2 free throw attempts, Miami was gifted one final opportunity to send this game into overtime and thwart the Spurs' title hopes.
Rebound, Bosch. Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang! Tie game with 5 seconds remaining.
An insane bucket that the Florida franchise backed up with a game-winning extra period, forcing the ultimate round into one final Game 7.
Everybody, we were at the dinner and it was so quiet. We were so sad, and that was a tough dinner. But it just shows you that winning or losing, you know, we were together.
But the tragic news only continued for Tony and his Spurs, as the Heat, led by their own big 3 of LeBron James, Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, knowing just how fortunate they were to have even been playing this game, put forth their greatest effort, dominating their rivals and seeing themselves earning back-to-back championships.
I never felt so sad in basketball, because you always talk about that, Pop, you know, life is bigger and it's more important stuff, you know, in life. But man, that one was tough. I remember I was in the locker room and I took a towel and I put it in my head, because it's the first time I wanted to cry and I couldn't look at you or look at my teammates. I was so sad. And you were talking and I was listening to you, but I had my towel and I was I couldn't believe what just happened.
A devastating reality that no matter what anyone did throughout the offseason, that any Spur could ignore.
We all lived with it, thought about it every day. There wasn't one day would go by and we'd be at dinner or something and somebody would mention it. And I'd say, I almost went the whole day. And you have to bring that up. You know, I was actually going to have a clear day today and you brought it up again.
So Coach Pop devised a plan as they opened training camp for the 2013-2014 season.
I've always been a believer that players react better to the truth than blowing smoke at them or trying to manipulate them or, you know, tell them something so they'll do this or that. But if you tell them the truth and you really go after it, now that assumes one thing, that the people you're telling the truth to have the kind of character that you guys have so you can deal with it.
Forcing each and every one of his team to rewatch both Game 6 and 7, proving to a squad that their failure had nothing to do with luck. Rather, it was their own failures that prevented this dynasty from raising their 5th banner. But the question still remained. With an aging roster, Duncan at 37, Manu 36, and Tony 31, with 11 players born outside of the US, could they even return to the NBA Finals, let alone the playoffs?
A lot of people didn't believe in us. They thought we were too old, like always.
May 4th, 2014. After another dominant regular season, San Antonio is just 48 minutes away from being eliminated in just the first round and repeating their 2011 failure against the Grizzlies, this time at the hands of state rival, the Dallas Mavericks. Only Tony Parker, remembering his promise to Duncan, wasn't going to let his franchise fail. No, because after a 32-point performance, San Antonio had finally advanced to the second round before destroying the Portland Trail Blazers in just 5 games and avenging their 2012 failure by demolishing the Thunder in 6, seeing them advancing yet again to the NBA Finals against the Miami Heat.
I didn't look at it like a revenge, you know, I look at it more like a rematch because I have a lot of respect for Miami. But we were very happy to play them because we wanted to get another shot at it.
But as the buzzer rang out on the San Antonio Spurs home court in Game 2, Miami had been filled with confidence.
Then Game 2, we won Game 2, and I just knew we were going to three-peat, man. I was confident.
Yet the Spurs, desperate after 7 long years, weren't going to let this failure impact their title hopes.
There's no panic after the loss, you know, we lose Game 2, but we know we're playing a great team, and we're a great team too.
Therefore, as the ball was tipped for Game 3, what would eventually become known as the beautiful game truly reached its peak.
I think that's the thing that I'm the most proud is the character that we showed and the mentality to never give up and to come back the year after. The way we played that series, I think it was by far the best Spurs basketball and maybe some of the best in the NBA history.
With the basketball in constant motion, Miami's elite defense was simply unable to keep up. Insane basketball that saw the San Antonio Spurs, after victories in Game 3, 4, and then 5, crowned with their franchise's 5th title, and Tony Parker slipping the 4th ring of his career onto his loaded hand. Speaking of San Antonio Spurs success, if you want to learn more about how the Texas franchise is looking to rebirth their dynasty, check out this video about why the entire NBA is terrified of their new cornerstone, Victor Wembanyama, and learn why the next decade, like it did in the 2000s, might just once again belong to San Antonio.